Ever wonder how those companies, the ones killing it, doing everything right, still manage to trip and fall?
Yeah.
Like they're listening to their customers, right? Investing in the latest and greatest tech, but then, boom, out of nowhere, some competitor with what seems like, honestly, an inferior product swoops in and shakes up the whole game.
It's wild how often it isn't even bad luck or, mismanagement that takes down these giants.
It's like they're so busy climbing, they miss the volcano right next to them.
It's true. They become successful by listening to those customers, investing in R&D, but those same strength can blind them to the disruptive stuff brewing.
And that brings us to today's deep dive, The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. This book's a classic, and for good reason.
It really flipped the script on how we see innovation, success, the whole 9 yards.
We're going to unpack why those good companies, the ones playing by the rules, sometimes still end up on the losing end of disruptive change.
Christensen argues that by being laser-focused on their existing customers and markets, companies actually become incapable of recognizing the potential in new tech, even if it's objectively better in the long run.
So, trapped by their own success, how did Christensen even figure this out?
He dove deep into a wild world. Disk drives.
Disk drives, huh? Sounds riveting.
Trust me, the disk drive industry back in the 80s and 90s, that's a gold mine.
Yeah.
It was constantly changing, innovation on overdrive, and just as much failure.
A real roller coaster.
Exactly. Christensen called it fast history. And this industry, with its rapid fire cycles, shows how this pattern of disruption played out again and again.
So we see it in disk drives, but this isn't just a tech thing, right?
Nope, not at all. Think Sears, praised for their management, right?
Textbook case, supposedly.
And yet they totally missed the boat on discount retailers. Walmart, Kmart, that whole wave.
Okay, so we see companies missing these game-changing shifts even when they're doing what seems smart. But why? Why does this happen? That's what we're going to get into today. And, more importantly, how to avoid the same fate, whether you're running a company or just trying to stay ahead in your own world.
Exactly. And to understand that, we need to talk about two types of technologies: sustaining and disruptive.
Break it down for us. What's the difference?
So sustaining technologies, those are all about making what already works even better.
The next generation, but not a totally new thing?
Exactly. Faster cars, smartphones with killer cameras, that's what I'm talking about. Improvements existing customers can get excited about.
Okay, so those make sense. You've got a happy customer. They want the better version of what they already have. What about disruptive tech then? How's that different?
Now, disruptive technologies, they're sneakier. See, at first they often look, well, kind of worse.
Worse? How so?
They might be simpler, cheaper, maybe even fewer bells and whistles compared to what's already out there. The key is they often appeal to a different crowd, a smaller market. Maybe one that's just emerging or was totally overlooked before.
So instead of a smartphone with a fancier camera, it'd be something that changes how we even use phones.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Disruptive tech doesn't stay stagnant. It evolves crazy fast, and before you know it, it's not just good enough. It's often better than the old way of doing things.
That's got to be when the big players start to sweat, right?
Oh, absolutely. Remember those 8-inch disk drives? Total game changer.
You mentioned them earlier.
At the time, they weren't good enough for mainframes, which was the market. But for these new mini computers popping up, they were perfect. And the leading companies, so focused on their mainframe customers, they missed the boat completely. The companies that embraced those 8-inch drives, they're the ones who ended up shaking up the entire industry.
Wild. And if you're one of those companies that missed out, that's got to sting. So all this brings us back to our big question. Why do good companies, with all the resources, the brain power, the history of success, why do they miss these disruptions coming?
That, my friend, is where Christensen's 5 principles of disruptive innovation come in.
5 principles. All right, hit me.
They explain how even the smartest companies can make decisions that seem totally logical at the time, but in the long run, lead them right off a cliff.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's unpack these principles. I have a feeling everyone, not just CEOs and tech giants, can learn from this.
You got it. First up, resource dependence. Sounds obvious, but it's a trap. Companies, they rely on their customers, their investors, right?
Makes sense. Got to keep the lights on.
So they listen to those customers, they invest in what the market seems to want, and their whole structure becomes about delivering what's profitable. But this focus, this laser focus, it can make them blind to the needs of those emerging markets, the ones where disruptive tech often takes root.
So if you're not looking forward, you're looking backward. They're so busy pleasing the customers they have, they don't see the ones they could have.
Bingo. And Christensen's research is packed with examples. Look at Seagate and the whole 3.5-inch disk drive situation.
What happened there?
They were all in on satisfying their mainframe customers, totally missed the rise of 3.5-inch drives that were perfect for, you guessed it, portable computers.
Wow. The irony is they probably had the tech, they were just looking the wrong way.
Precisely. Okay, principle number 2. Small markets don't solve the growth needs of large companies.
Meaning?
It's all about scale. If you're a company raking in billions, a small market, even one with potential, might not even move the needle, right?
Not worth the effort when you're chasing those massive returns.
Right. Imagine you're making $4 billion a year. To grow 20%, you need to find another $800 million. A tiny new market, even if it blows up later, isn't going to cut it in the short term.
So the easier, more tempting path is to go upmarket, more features, higher prices, even if it means neglecting the lower end.
And that creates a huge blind spot. While they're moving upmarket, disruption's often coming from the bottom, simpler, cheaper, good enough to pull in a whole new segment of customers.
So they get squeezed from both ends. Not good.
Recipe for disaster. Now, principle 3 throws a real wrench in traditional thinking. Markets that don't exist can't be analyzed.
I mean, that's kind of stating the obvious, isn't it?
But companies try. You can't do market research on something that hasn't fully emerged yet.
It's like asking for directions to a place that's still being built.
Exactly. Think about Honda's success with motorcycles here in the U.S.
Weren't they going up against Harley-Davidson?
Head to head. But instead of targeting Harley's customer base, they focused on smaller, lighter bikes. Back then, those were seen as niche.
But that turned out to be genius. They tapped into a whole new market.
A market Harley hadn't even considered. They weren't afraid to experiment, to learn as they went, and that made all the difference. Which brings us to principle 4. Capabilities define disabilities.
Okay, now that one sounds counterintuitive.
It's all about perspective. What you're good at can also hold you back. A company's strength, the tech they've mastered, their processes, even their culture can become liabilities when the game changes.
So past success as a barrier to future success.
It happens all the time. It's like trying to use the same map for completely different terrain. You have to adapt, even if it means challenging what made you successful in the first place.
That's got to be a tough pill to swallow for a lot of companies. All right, we've covered 4 principles, each one a potential landmine. What's the final trap Christensen warns us about?
Okay, so 4 principles down, each one a potential trap for companies that think they've got it all figured out. This last one, capabilities define disabilities. That one really stuck with me.
It's a big one.
Makes you realize that what you're good at can also be what holds you back, you know?
Exactly. You get stuck in your ways.
So what's principle number 5? What's the last trap Christensen throws our way?
This one's all about the breakneck speed of technology. Christensen calls it. Technology supply may not equal market demand.
Hold on. So you're saying tech can actually improve faster than what the market wants? Sometimes, yeah. Think about it. There's a limit to how fast customers can adopt new tech, right? And how much they're willing to pay for every little upgrade.
I mean, people are creatures of habit, right? We like what we like.
And technology doesn't care about our habits. It just keeps moving.
So this gap between what's possible and what the market is actually ready for, that's where disruption takes root.
You got it. Disruptive innovations, they thrive in that gap. Come in with a good enough product, cheaper price tag, and suddenly they're pulling in a whole new crowd. And before you know it, that good enough product, it's blown past the old guard.
A 1-2 punch, right.
Yeah.
They're focused on the wrong customers, and they're getting technologically outmaneuvered. So what's the game plan? Knowing all this, can these companies actually do anything to avoid this?
They can. It's not all doom and gloom. Christensen lays out some strategies, and they all come down to this. Change the context.
So don't try to win by playing by the old rule.
Exactly. Shake things up. And one of the best ways to do that is to create a separate, independent organization dedicated to that disruptive thing you're trying to do.
Like a startup, but inside the bigger company, with its own goals, its own structure, everything.
You got it. That new team, they need the freedom to move differently without being weighed down by the way the main company does things.
Less red tape, more innovation.
Think back to Control Data. They managed to launch those 5.25-inch drives by setting up a completely separate unit, different city, different mindset.
Gave them space to breathe.
Exactly. And that brings us to strategy number 2. Match size and structure to the opportunity. Don't try to cram a disruptive idea into a system that's built for something else entirely.
Don't expect a massive return from a market that's just finding its footing.
Exactly. Christensen uses Allen Bradley as an example here. They were successful with electronic motor controls because they acquired smaller, more agile companies.
So acquisition's not about absorbing, but about leveraging what those smaller companies already have.
Exactly. Now, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds great, but where do I even start? Especially when you're dealing with these undefined, disruptive spaces.
It's the million-dollar question.
And that's where Christensen says, plan for learning, not just execution.
Okay, so be flexible. Don't be afraid to pivot.
Traditional market research, it only gets you so far in these uncharted waters. You've got to be willing to test, experiment, adjust your course as you go.
Like navigating by the stars instead of a map.
Love that analogy. It's not about having all the answers up front. It's about being open to discovery. Which leads us to Christensen's final and arguably most challenging piece of advice. Be willing to cannibalize your own business.
Now that one sounds a little scary.
It can be, but think about it. Clinging to the past is a surefire way to get blindsided by the future.
So even if you've got a successful product, be open to the idea that something you create might replace it.
Exactly. HP is a great example of this. When inkjet printers came along, it was a threat to their cash cow laser printers.
That should have been a tough call. Did they try to protect the laser printer business?
Nope. They embraced inkjet, even though it meant potentially disrupting themselves. And guess what? One of their smartest moves. They became a leader in inkjet and strengthened their overall position.
Wow. Proof that sometimes you have to disrupt yourself to stay ahead. So we've covered a lot of ground today. Why companies fail, those 5 principles of disruption, and some ways to navigate these choppy waters. As we wrap up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all this?
Here it is. This isn't just about business. These principles of disruption, they apply everywhere. Every industry, every organization, even to us as individuals.
We're all navigating constant change.
And the ones who thrive, they're the ones who embrace it. The ones who are willing to adapt, to challenge the status quo, to disrupt even their own thinking.
It's about being aware of those disruptive forces, understanding how they work, and then being brave enough to change with them or even get ahead of them.
Absolutely.
It's challenging, but it's also exciting. It's about creating the future, not just reacting to it. And that wraps up another deep dive. We hope this episode has given you a lot to think about. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.